Welcome back, everyone. This week's episode, we're talking about training intensities, and there's so much to unpack when we look at training intensities that we're actually going to break this up into multiple parts. So, this week, we are going to be talking about absolute load and auto regulation and how to put it into your training. So, Andy, before we get into these two topics, let's go ahead and define what training intensity actually means.
So yeah, you can imagine somebody getting on the leg press and like starting off with 10 plates on each side and doing 20 reps and like stripping it down to where they can't even, lift the leg and they get off the leg press and they'll say, man, that set was intense. All right. And yeah, they're often use the word intense as if like how much effort, like you said, they're putting into it. But the way we want to use intensity is basically how close you are to a maximal effort. So, and particularly a maximal weight lifted. So we're talking really percentage of 1 RM and along those lines. So I think that's the main way to distinguish it is not how close you are to maximal exhaustion, but how close you are to the most you could possibly do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good way to put it. So let's go ahead and dive into various ways to measure it. So let's go ahead and first start with absolute load. So let's go ahead and start there, Andy.
Yeah, absolute load. Pretty easy. If 225 pounds on the bench press is more intense than 135 pounds, one plate is less intense than two plates. This seems like almost obvious, but it does have its merits for people who are just starting off with resistance training. Uh, Increasing the intensity by an absolute load, say like 5 pounds on upper body, 10 pounds on lower body, is a completely legitimate way of going about it. Uh, it is best used, in my view, in a linear progression model, meaning that we are just taking somebody from A to B over the course of, say, 6 to 12 weeks, and every workout or every week, we are adding a certain amount of weight to the bar. And it can be used in other circumstances for, say, like a power lifter who just knows that they want to put 5 pounds on a lift every like few months or whatever, but it's mostly used in a beginner setting where people are just starting off with resistance training and they just need something very simple to understand because maybe they don't even have a one rep max, so they don't even know what a percent increase would be. You just add weight until they can't do it anymore, and then you alter course from there. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think with it, I know we get the question all the time about people wanting to progress auxiliaries
Mm,
because we talk about intensities, various forms of it. People see it so often for those core lifts, right? Your bench, squat, deadlift.
yeah,
But then people get to the auxiliaries and they're really not sure how to progress that. It's a very
yeah,
simple one there. We're
yeah,
not progressing reps. If I'm staying 4 by 10 for simplicity's sake, I can easily say, like, hey, well, how I'm going to progress this is by the load lifted, right? So if
right.
it's something like maybe I'm adding 2.5 pounds each week, and it's crazy because people think like, oh, 2.5 pounds, that's not much, but 2.5 pounds stacked over time, and I'm pretty sure we've said it on this channel before, turns into a lot of progress, right?
Yeah, 2.5 pounds per week for 52 weeks ends up being well over 100 pounds, well over
Yeah.
125 pounds thereabouts. So yeah, it's definitely a lot. Here's the other thing is ways I'll use absolute load with a intermediate or advanced training, and that is on the auxiliary lifts, like you said. And let's just use like lat pull down, for example. I'll say, hey, I want 4 sets of 8 to 12 reps with 1 minute rest in between. So I'm controlling and I want it at this weight, right? So I'm controlling the amount of time between sets so that they don't get more or less rest from week to week. And I just tell them, hey, do as many reps as you can for within this context. So I'll start with a 12 rep max. And week one, they do a set of 12, second set, set of 11, then a set of 10, then a set of 8, right? Week two, they get a little bit better. The 12, set of 12, set of 10, set of 10. Week four, they're finally able to do 4 sets of 12 with 1 minute rest in between. Cool. I'll throw on 20 pounds and start all over again, right? And so a person may be only be able to do like 4 sets of 8, but they don't get to bump up weight until they've been able to hit 4 sets of 12, the upper limits of the rep range, with 1 minute rest in between each set. That's I think, a more advanced way of using absolute load. So it's just not for beginners.
No, no, yeah. I think that's a phenomenal way to do it. It's very easy for them to progress that way. Hey, if I can't get
Very
it 4 by 12, this is the weight I'm staying at until I get there. And then it
exactly.
also takes the ego out of lifting, right? Like if somebody's not meeting the intent, they're like, oh, well, let me try to bump up weight. And now they're missing the intent of that movement for the sets and reps, like it's forcing them to get the intent there. No, I think that's a great way to do it. Cool. Andy, anything else you want to add with absolute load and before we move on from there?
No, we don't want to believe we're going to get to the fun stuff. So let's keep it
Yeah,
moving.
I agree. So let's go into some auto regulation work. Let's start with RPE, RIR, the various ways you can use those two. And then oftentimes people use those fairly interchangeably. So let's explain what the actual difference is on these as
Yeah.
well.
Okay. So RPE stands for rate of perceived exertion. And the way it came about was back in the 70s when research universities were doing a lot of experimentation with cardiovascular training, GMAT, stuff like that. And somebody had a mask over their face. They needed a way to be able to communicate to that person, okay, how hard is this for you? And so they created a 1 by 20 scale, 20 being the hardest thing they ever do. They can't do anything more, to 1. And they just had a person point to that number. Oh, now I'm at a 10, now I'm at a 12, now I'm at 18, I'm almost maxed out, right? And then they decided that, well, a simpler way of doing it is just doing 1 through 10, because 1 through 10 is a little clunky. And then they started applying it to resistance training, where you could say, hey, I want you to give me 4 sets of 8, and I want the RPE to be a 6 out of 10, right? And then what it allows the person to understand, well, 6 out of 10, that's a little bit more than like halfway in terms of difficulty. If you were to do, I want you to do a 1 set of 1 at 10, RPE of 10, that is a 1 rep max. It's the definition of 1 rep max. And so it's a quick and easy way of like allowing a person to just go on feel. And if they're having a particularly bad day, well, they just lower the weight in order for them to stay in that intensity range. RIR stands for reps in reserve, and it's very similar to RPE. So an RPE of 8 is basically the equivalent of an RIR of 2. You have 2 reps left in the tank. And so in both circumstances, it's really helpful when you're using at or near max weight, where you say, hey, I want you to do 5 sets of 1, but I want them to be an RPE of 9. So not an all out max, but just a little shy. Um, or you could say, I want you to do, 5 sets of 5. And at the end of every set, there should be an RIR of 3 reps. So you have 3 reps left in the tank. It's intuitive. It allows you to auto regulate. And those are the pros. Cons are, for somebody who has never really lifted before, they can over or underestimate what that is. So I can think of a female client I have right now. She is twice as strong as what she thinks she is. She'll have what's the equivalent of 70% of her 1 rep max on the bar, and she'll think it's an RP of 10, right? And then you have the opposite, where you have maybe your young, like 18-year-old, where all he wants to do in life is just the best 315. He benches 305 for a double, and it's a freaking war on that second rep. And he says, oh, I could get 315 for 2. No, you can't. Right, yeah. You wouldn't be able to budge 310. I'd throw a paperclip on that bar and you would get buried. And so there is a level of maturity that comes along with RIR and RPE, but intuitively, it makes a whole lot of sense to people. The other thing, too, is even with a more advanced trainee who's kind of tuned in to RPE and RIR, is with a particular lift, if you never used RPE before, it takes about 5 to 6 weeks to really dial in what that RPE, to get that RPE accurate. So even with the more advanced person, one of the limitations are your weights aren't really fine tuned and accurate using RPE until you get at least a month in. Those are my initial thoughts on those two. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, RPE and RIR get used pretty interchangeably. So you'll see people say like you said, RPE at 8, and they're thinking 2 reps left on the tank, which is equivalent to an RIR up to. So when I start looking at the two from a coaching standpoint, I tend to look at an RPE as an overall session, similar to
Hmm.
how like I don't know, I'm sure you guys did in football where you take RPEs from practices,
Yeah.
so that way you would look at the week. So I tend to look at an RPE for a whole session, and then I'm looking at the RIR for individual lifts
Hmm.
within that
Right.
session. So that way, if
Right.
I'm measuring, if I'm trying to go like a high low model in training, I'm measuring that based off the RPE. Like, so if I
Yeah.
can say, like, hey, this is intended to be an RPE 7 overall day. So I want day 2 to be an RPE 2 to 3.
Yeah.
I think is a good way to measure it out throughout the week. And then I like to use that RIR for showing the efforts within the sessions there.
Yeah.
Um, and so, like, I was having a discussion with somebody on, they were talking about like an RPE if it's subscribed, or if it's prescribed, not subscribed, yeah, prescribed as an RPE of 6. They were viewing it as like that is just what the maximal training intensity, like, it's just how heavy is the bar. And to which I
Yeah.
disagree with, because if it's an RPE of 6, that doesn't necessarily mean like it has to be a heavy load. And I give the example from like a 225 rep max. I said,
Hmm.
it could be, I can put 225 pounds in the bar and say I'm doing 3 by 5. And, that could be a fairly low RPE for me. But if I put 225 on the bar and do a rep max, then it's a RPE of 10, right? Just
Yeah.
because it's 225 isn't changing what that RPE is for me. What's changing the RPE is how many reps I'm actually doing. And if we're looking over time, because I'm sure you've seen
Yeah.
very simple programming where it's, hey, 5 by 5 at 75%. Well,
Yeah.
set 5 feels way different than what set 1 feels like, right?
Right, right, right. And we have to be careful here because now we're getting that could be misinterpreted as the leg press example I used earlier with the bodybuilder, where they're just like, well, I'm just gonna smoke myself with this sub max weight for a lot of reps and I get a good pump.
Mhm.
But again, there's a subtle difference in that the bodybuilder is thinking, how fatigued are my muscles versus the your example, the 225 is, well, what is your maximum amount of reps you can hit with this sub max weight? And if we take you to that max, that was an intense effort,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing to keep in mind, talking about RPE is, I'm sure you've probably done this in the past of load management with a individual or a team. Overall load management when it comes to practice, when it comes to cardiovascular training, resistance training. What we want to do is make sure that our acute stresses don't spike too high above what their chronic stresses are, and you need a way of quantifying that with in a sports setting, well, you quantify that by maybe total amount of weight or tonnage lifted over the course of a week. You combine that with total mileage that they spend on the field, combined with like high intensity effort, like sprints or whatever, and then you get a load. But for those who don't have fancy dancy technology, very good cheap substitute is just taking the amount of time a training session lasted times how they rate the RPE for that session. I don't know if you've used that before.
So I haven't used what you just said. We
Yeah,
did a lot of load management because I was over Catapult when we did it,
yeah, yeah,
and that was super simple,
yeah.
especially too. Which it works phenomenal with autoregulation on that as well, because what we would do is we would take an RPE at the end of practices. They would do health wellness questionnaires a couple times per week. So
Mhm.
if I ever had an individual talking about like, hey, my low back's starting to feel tight, we've been around plenty of coaches where like, oh no, he's fine. His low back's not tight. Well, if
Right.
I can get that information, I can then go see the data of like, hey, well, his high speed yards went
Yeah,
from 95 per week on average to now 450 a week because we just moved into kickoff team.
yeah.
That's a good sign that his low back probably is tight, right?
Right,
So
right,
like
right, right.
being able to pair those metrics together,
And I was going to say for a lot of our modern athlete clients who use the train road gap, train road, you open the session, it's going to ask you kind of how you feel that day. different lists of questions, and it's essentially trying to measure your readiness. And then after the session's over, you press start, you press stop. When you press stop, it just gives you a time of how long that training session lasts. It's going to ask you, like, how hard is this, which is essentially an RPE scale. And so it's taking RPE times time, and that is your load for that day. And if you, as a coach, I just had experience with this where all the numbers for my client have been relatively the same, like same running week to week, same lifting week to week, just small minor changes. And yet the overall load, his RPE times the training time, has spiked. Oh, well, what's the deal? Now that gives me valuable information as a coach to start digging in and finding out what's happening. It just so happened with this particular client, he was just not eating enough carbs. So he was in a
Yeah.
carb deficit, and so all the workouts felt harder, right? The downside to using RPE over the course of a whole session as opposed to over a whole set is if you finish a workout with, say, a finisher, you're likely to, and you answer the quiz right after the session, you're likely to project the difficulty of the session based upon that finisher. So if you smoke yourself for 10 minutes, oh man, that session was an RPE of 10. Well, actually, the session was a 6 right up until you did the smoker, and the smoker was a 10. And then you have to be careful of. I know there's research out there like, hey, what you really want to do is give a client or an athlete like 10 minutes after a session and then ask them how hard the session was. And you can even go up to like 24 hours. So if you don't get that data, like me as a coach, if I don't get that data off a trainer, or if I can go to my client like, hey, can you rate the RPE of yesterday's session? And they can recall with pretty good accuracy how hard yesterday's session was. So again, interesting ways of using RPE that people don't really think about, but lots of ways that it can be used for auto regulation, like you said.
Yeah, and I like what you just said there with the 24 hours because, like,
Mhm.
as we getting older, we pay more attention to recovery and then how we're feeling the next day
Mhm.
after a session. 21, I didn't think about that at all, unfortunately. But
Right,
yeah,
right.
that is a very good indicator of how I feel like my body handled that session because
Mhm.
I feel like the first few steps in the morning definitely tells me how, like, if it's an extended run, if it's a high intensity run, like how, like, I respond to it. So yeah, I like
Mhm.
that. Going close to 24 hours afterwards. The one thing I want to go back to, I brought up the example of, like, hey, 5 by 5 at 75%. There's a difference
Mhm.
between a first set versus the fifth set. Do you ever program RPE as the sets as a whole? So not
Mhm.
necessarily by the individual
Yeah.
set, but if it's, hey, by the time you finish your fifth set, this is the rate of
Yeah.
perceived exertion.
I don't. I've never tried it. I'm not quite sure what the advantage would be, but I don't see any harm in doing it for sure.
Yeah, I've
Yeah.
heard some people say it before, so I was curious.
Yeah. I could see for say like we're doing some volume work, or say we're working up to like a max effort or a a high weight set, a heavy set. I could see like, hey, I want you to do, 6 sets of 5, RP of 5, RP of 6, RP of 7, RP of 8, RP of 9, RP of 10 or whatever. And that's a way of ramping them up. Or I could see it being, hey, do an RPE of 6, an RPE of 7, and then I want you to do 5 sets of 5 at an RPE of 8. Now, if that's the case, their weight should decrease over those 5 sets of 5 because fatigue will have caught up with them. If it hasn't, then they're either not being honest or they're just blissfully unaware of what's happening to their body. So, but yeah, going back to your original point of, hey, for bench press today, look, I just want you to get 5 sets of 5, or I want you to get a total of 25 reps. And overall, I want to feel like an 8. I've never tried that, but certainly open to hearing feedback for anybody who has.
Yeah, absolutely. And then last question I have for you on auto regulation when it comes to programming for clients. And it's similar to that episode you shared with me a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about power lifters getting to, them feeling 1.5 reps left in the tank versus
Yeah.
1 rep left in the tank.
Yeah.
When it comes to autoregulation with your clients, do you have a point like you mentioned earlier that it's very difficult for novice lifters to know like what a couple left in the tank feels like? Do you have a threshold that you want your clients to have reached at like a training age with
Yeah.
before we start to get a little bit more autoregulation in the program?
No, no. So two ideas about, let's come back to the RPE of point 0.5, RPE of 8.5 or 7.5. Uh, but to answer your question, no, I don't. It just is a matter of trust that I have in the athlete. So I'll often ask my client or an athlete or whoever I want this to be an RPE of 8, and I want you to send me a video of the last set. Okay. I know what an RPE of 8 looks like on a squat versus a bench versus a deadlift versus overhead press versus pull ups. And I know how many reps are left in the tank on each one of those two. Once I get evidence that what the athlete is reporting matches up with what I see in the videos, then I'm like, okay, this athlete is now in tune. I now feel comfortable that I can just, you know, do RPE moving forward and it's okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always, you come from the powerlifting background. I feel like all the powerlifters that I know, I feel like they're phenomenal at looking at that bar speed and I'm like, yeah, I think you had another one, or like, I think that was the last one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
for
yeah, I think
sure.
yeah, you guys have it down pat.
And just being a former coach with Division One football in particular, like, I was responsible for making sure these future multi-million-dollar athletes, progressed optimally. And if they didn't go up in on raising the bar unless I said so. And so to overshoot was unacceptable. And to be so conservative and play it safe that they're doing something that's inappropriately light is unacceptable. And so there was a lot of pressure to make sure that, like the three bears, not too much, not too little, but just right. It was important to get it just right. And so that was really important in my coaching eye of seeing that. And
Yeah.
as you know, like once you spend a little bit of time under the bar too, and know what it feels like yourself, you kind of get a sense of what it feels like yourself versus what you're seeing in the athlete, and you just make sure they match up.
Yeah, and that's another thing, kind of going back to about being under the bar, feeling it. And then you also mentioned the video earlier. If you're someone who's new to using auto regulation, film yourself because there's a lot of times I've moved a bar that I thought like, shit, this feels heavy, but
Yeah.
then the bar speed looks fine.
Yes.
Like
Right.
film yourself, look
Right.
at it. um,
It often feels slower than what it actually looks on camera.
yeah, like there's plenty
Yeah.
of times where I'm like, oh, that's like that moved slow, and be like, honestly, I thought it looked pretty good.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. And the other thing too is, I think that one thing that doesn't really get talked about that much is when you're handling especially heavy weights or you're doing a max effort set, you have to get psychologically aroused. It's part of the deal. And if you're getting amped up, oftentimes adrenaline is involved. And we know that when there's a lot of adrenaline coursing through your veins, your perception of time and motion tends to slow down. And so, what you sense as something being really slow and taking forever actually doesn't take that long. So you often hear this when athletes talk about when the game's on the line and the quarterback throws the ball and it's in the air. Man, it just for the receiver, it's like, man, it felt like that ball just took forever to get to me, right? Or the game slowed down. They say the game slowed down. I just knew where everything was going, and that's part because they're not scrambling. They know they can see recognize the patterns of movement in front of them. But part of it too is just the adrenaline. Your perception of time and motion tends to slow down, which is anyway. We can go down the rabbit hole more, but
that is interesting because you do hear, if you're watching any sports documentary, they're talking about a big play, and they're like, "Yeah, time stood still." So that's
right,
interesting. I haven't heard that side of it before, though.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but then, like to go back to it, you talked about amping yourself up for a big lift. Like it's like I said before, heavy weight is supposed to scare you to some degree. If you're
right,
not like if you're
yeah,
not worried at all, it's probably not that heavy, right? So like
right,
getting
right,
under
right,
a heavy barbell, squatting and bringing back up it should
Yeah.
scare you a little bit. So it's not.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I heard one coach say when he was harping on his athletes to get lower on the squat, he said, you know what they call people who don't squat to depth? Cowards. And what and basically he was pointing out the fact, like you said, it is scary. And if you don't respect the weight, if you're not a little, if you're not a little unnerved by the amount of weight that's on your back, then, probably not pushing hard enough. So,
no, yeah, absolutely. So, Andy, we've talked a lot on different parts of autoregulation training. And next week, our episode is on percentage based training. To wrap up this week's episode, let's talk a little bit about why somebody benefits from autoregulation training compared to percentage based training without diving too much into next week's episode.
yeah, okay. So the short and skinny is that life can get really lifey, meaning that there are things that are going to happen that is going to throw off your ability to repeat your one rep max day in and day out. Some days you're stronger, some days you're weaker. And if you are having one of those days where you feel particularly weak and you decide to stick to your percentage based program, you're basically putting a round peg in a square hole and you're going to be overtraining or overreaching. So that's it in a nutshell is auto regulating is a way of accounting for the fact that some days we got it and some days we don't.
Sorry, it was muted there. But yeah, and I like it from the sense of, again, not diving too far into next week. Your max is going to change every single day. Like you talked
Yeah.
about life happens, sleep happens. You brought up the carbohydrate deficit earlier.
Yeah.
All these things affect how you move a weight, right?
Yep.
So if we know that we didn't sleep, we know our cortisol levels are elevated because of everything else that's happening in life. This allows us to train at a much more it allows us to train, I guess, in a safer space is what I'm trying to say. Like,
Yeah.
because like we're not so, hey, it has to be here. I
Yeah.
can dial it back. But on the flip side of it, if you've slept phenomenally, like you have multiple meals in you, if it's the Friday after Thanksgiving and your
Hmm.
glycogen levels are full, it allows
Right.
you to, on the other end, maybe push a little harder those days, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a way of just auto regulating as long as you know what you're doing is a way of optimizing your workouts. So you're not overreaching or training maximally and or underreaching or not living up to your potential. But again, you're hitting the weights and intensity of the volume exactly of what you need for that particular time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've
Yep.
always been a big fan of auto regulation. I've done it a lot in my training. I'd gone back and forth between the two, and I've had good success with both of them. I think it's appropriate at certain times for each, and we'll explain
Yeah.
next week why percentage based training can be such a big tool. And I will
Yeah.
say I'm a huge fan of getting into that 65 to 80% range to sit
Yeah.
there and gain strength, and I've had varied success there.
Yeah,
So
it's interesting. I know that auto regulation is an awesome tool for optimizing workouts. I personally don't like it because I am somebody who I just self-aware as I know that I get inside my own head and I'll start thinking about my workout, previous workout, today's workout, tomorrow's workout, and I'll start overthinking everything when you ever do that when you have maybe an email to write and you end up what could be said in one sentence you run on for like 5 or 6 paragraphs and
one
sometimes what your initial
one
impression
sentence,
is
5 or 6 paragraphs.
yeah,
That's when you
like,
throw it in chat GPT and you give it the cue, use less words.
yeah.
And then it comes down to
But
one.
anyway, the way I know that because I'll overthink everything and I'll start second guessing myself, and because I don't have a coach, I refuse to have a coach because I am a coach at the moment. That the way I view things now is percentage based training is what I'm going with, and if I don't feel good from day to day, it's because I haven't controlled the variables of my life. And if I don't get enough sleep, if I don't eat properly, if I'm not controlling my stress levels, then theoretically speaking, as long as I control those things, the percentage based training should work. And so I put myself uh, in a position where I have to control all those other those variables that keep me healthy and primed and ready. I'm not saying it's good to do. I'm not prescribing this for any of our listeners, but that's just where I'm at right now.
Well, you're doing that competition in November with Jordan, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that definitely helps when you talk about maximizing some of these other factors because, like we've said before on here, putting something on the calendar drives you, right? It
Yeah.
because you don't want to get out there and you don't want to fail, you don't want to be embarrassed. So like you are maximizing your sleep, you're maximizing your diet. So like you probably do feel, significantly, you probably do feel similar throughout the day. And you probably know like, hey, this is how I typically feel on Thursday, like on Thursdays compared to Mondays, because that's a huge thing to measure too, or to think about when we're building out a training week is I know some people that feel great on Mondays. I know some people that want a couple days into the training week
Right.
before they put their hard training session into there. So
Right.
knowing where you're at is huge.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing too is that if you are like, you could use auto regulation in your training as a license to make poor decisions in your lifestyle habits. Like, oh, I'm working up to what feels like a 1 RM tomorrow. Or I'm working up to an RP of 10 tomorrow. Well, screw it. Let's go out and see a movie at midnight then. What does it matter whether you can use it as a license to be like, it doesn't matter. Either way, I'm going to be doing RP of 10. So what does it matter if I'm capable of doing 300 pounds or 200 pounds? And so, yeah, it's just things you have to consider if you're going down that trail.
Yeah, knowing you have a 92% on Monday will definitely impact what decisions you make on the weekend, right?
No, no doubt, no doubt. And it's like I like the point you brought up about different days of week feel different. Some people like Monday because they feel refreshed from the weekend. Some people like to go heavy and hard on Wednesday because that's when they feel like primed and they kind of they got the Mondays behind them. And some people are like, oh, I like Friday because I know I'm going to get 2 days rest and so I can spill it on Friday. It's interesting, and everybody's different. There's no one size fits all.
Yeah, it is interesting to hear where people like to put those sessions. I feel like I've seen, and tell me if you've seen it differently, guys that as they get older kind of like having those harder sessions a little bit into it.
Hmm.
Like a lot of the guys that I talk to, especially guys who run a fair amount, they like to put that hard session kind of like middle of the week for them,
Yeah,
to where
yeah,
in just and I could be wrong. It's just kind of observation just from talking to people here and there. The younger guys feel like Monday they're ready to send it, and then you get the
yeah.
ones who just completely send it on the weekend or before going on 2 days, 2 days, 1 day recover, which
Hmm.
isn't a bad idea. Like
Right.
if I know for me on my training sessions on Friday, just from, I get up at 3:45, so I try to be asleep by 8:30 each night, but
Yeah.
it doesn't always happen. So I know I'm a little bit more fatigued on Fridays.
Right.
So
Right.
my Friday session isn't necessarily a hard one. I know my Saturday session, I can make a longer run because I don't have to wake up to a 3:45 alarm clock. My husky will wake me up at 4:30, so that gets me 45 more minutes. That 45-minute helps. So
Right.
I would much rather do a longer run on Saturday where, you know, maybe when I get home on Friday, I cook a bigger meal.
Mm.
Um, and
Yeah.
it's just not being rushed in the morning definitely just makes it better. Well,
Yeah.
there's not the
That's
stress of getting up.
Yep. That's the argument for doing your hardest and or longest training sessions on Saturday or Sunday is that you aren't pressed for time at the beginning or the end. Is you can take your time. So if you're planning on doing a marathon lifting session or a long run or whatever, Saturday is obviously ideal for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, guys, that's our episode for the week. Let us know in the comments how autoregulation has worked for you or any questions you have about how to implement into your training. If you guys are interested in working with the Modern Athlete team, make sure to check out the links in our description for our training teams or for one on one coaching. We'll see you guys back here next week as we dive into percentage based training and potentially velocity based training into that episode as well. We'll see where the conversation goes. But we'll see you guys back here next week.